Hi there. Here's a short lesson on how to craft a story. I'm thinking the best way to start might be to listen to a good story, so here's one from Mike Birbiglia.
We went to this place called Katmai National Park, which is one of these places that has so many bears that when you arrive, they take you to what's called bear orientation. And they teach you, and it seems counterintuitive, but if you ever see a bear walking towards you, you're actually supposed to clap and make the bear aware of your presence. Like, I'm right here, bear! I'm right here! I'm Mike, and you're a bear, and we're okay with each other. And when they told me this, I was like, oh, I'm going to be murdered by a bear. Because that seems like basting yourself in barbecue sauce. You know, it's like, I'm right here, bear, I'm right here, and I taste fantastic. I've applied condiments so that I'll be less bland. Patty and I went fly fishing. I don't know if you've ever tried this, but it's much more difficult than it looks, and a river runs through it. We're waist deep in water. We're in the rubber pants, and there are salmon jumping out of the water in front of us, literally jumping, which is what I would do if I were a fish. That seems like a great field trip. You know, you're in the boring water all day, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I want to stay here and grow legs and become a human, which is what happened over time. Sorry, homeschoolers. Here's where it heats up. I'm with the fishing guide. My sister Patty's about 75 yards behind us, and I hear her say, Mike? And it was the voice of someone who was about to be mauled. It had a very distinct pitch, you know. It was like, Mike? Like right here, she thought there might be a bear. Right here, that's a bear. If she knew the whole time, it'd just be like, Mike! And I turn around, and there's an 8-foot brown bear walking towards her in the water. It was very surreal, because he wasn't running, you know. He wasn't like, I will murder you! Ah! He was just kind of docile, like, I'm a bear, etc. Well, here it was, my greatest fear my entire life, and I was proud of myself because I built up the courage to say, Guide, do something! And that guide snapped into action. He sprinted over in the water right at the bear, and he goes, Yeah! 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 And the bear walks away. He was just like, all right, I'm a bear, etc. And I was very relieved that my sister didn't get mauled. But in retrospect, I was a little angry at the guide. I was like, you know, you didn't tell me about the plan. You just told me to go, I'm right here, bear, I'm right here. And my name is Mike. It's like he gave me the bad parachute, you know, like everybody's chute goes off, and then I have the multicolored gym class parachute. I'm like, this doesn't do anything! Except build team skills!
So let's look at a picture of story structure. Here's a drawing with all the parts of a story on it. As you can see in the picture, there's a gray arrow in the background. That's a timeline. It's measuring the time of the telling of the story. In other words, as you tell the story, you're moving along this timeline. Once upon a time, blah, 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 until you get to the end. As you can see in the drawing, the first section of the story is the setup. This is the part that orients the audience. It gives them their bearings and lets them know what world they are in, who are the characters, just some basic information. Some people call this part of the story the norm, or the status quo, or the world, or the context, or the orientation. They all describe the same thing. Here's what's going on. Now let's get on with the story. In Mike's story, he goes to Katmai National Park with his sister in hopes of finding bears. And then something happens. The next part of a story is called the inciting incident. That's a technical term, but it also goes by a lot of different names. It's the first extraordinary thing that happens in the story. The part that hooks an audience in. Some people call it that, the hook. They also call it the tear because it rips the normal world apart, or the dilemma because some sort of dilemma is introduced, or a mystery or a challenge, something that makes the story move forward. Some people call it the Passover question, as in, why is this night different than any other night? Some people call it page 10, which is really a prompt, a reminder to the storytellers or writers to get to the part of the story that hooks people in soon. If you wait too long before getting to the inciting incident, the audience might check out. They're waiting for something to happen, and if nothing does, they might think this is not worth my while. So the idea is you want to get to it pretty quickly. The inciting incident of Mike Birbiglia's story is when he finds out he's at risk of being mauled by bears, which reminds me of another nickname for this part of the story, the bum 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 moment. Some people actually call it that. I do sometimes. The story continues, and it builds until it gets to the next pillar in story structure, the point of no return, the part of the story where things really escalate, and the audience wonders, how will this possibly work out? There's no going back, and maybe there's no going forward. In Mike's story, this happens when the bear approaches Patty. Oh no, she might get mauled. And then something big happens. The climax. This is the point of the entire story. Everything leads up to this moment. It's sometimes called the high point, or the big cheese, or the main event. It's the big thing that happens at the end. In Mike's story, the guide saves the day in an unexpected way. And that brings us to the denouement, also called the end, or the wrap-up, or the wind-up, or the strings, a nickname derived from Hollywood's treatment of this part of the story, where they swell the orchestra. It's a point where we process what happened in the climax. In Mike's story, this is when he points out that the guide did not train him properly, and it was like he gave him the gym class parachute. I find it's a good practice to pick out story elements from other people's stories, watch a story, hear it, and see if you can identify the inciting incident, the point of no return, and the climax. I'm going to share with you some techniques to pick out the climax, because the climax typically has certain characteristics. The climax almost always happens right towards the end. Certainly that's the case in Mike's story. The guide saves the day in the end. It also marks a significant change in the course of action, meaning one thing is happening throughout the story, and then we get to the climax, and now things are very different. Throughout Mike's story, there's a risk of a bear altercation, but now that the guide has saved the day, it's not a problem. Often the climax of a story will have a reveal, where something is made known to a character or to the audience, or both, information that was previously hidden. When the guide charges the bear, Mike and the audience find out for the first time about the Hiya plan. Some climaxes are marked with an extreme physical event. Someone is murdered, or someone is attacked, or perhaps something is destroyed, or someone starts crying hysterically. In this case, the guide charging the bear and screaming Hiya might count. And finally, one of the best identifiers for main events or climaxes is this question. If you were to end the story just after the climax occurs, would it be the same? Does anything happen after this climactic moment that's essential? Or can you end the story now? If you can end it now, you may well be at the climax. Once the guide charges the bear and saves the day, the story is basically over. We don't have Mike's funny commentary on the event, but we do know what happened. For all practical purposes, the story is done. So, there you go. You now know how stories are structured and some ways to identify main events. The next step is for you to create a story. Go ahead. The world awaits.